So here we go on your big tour of the human body. So through our time together, what you'll be doing is you'll be learning the language of anatomy and physiology, or structure and function. And so much like some of your other biology classes, you may have determined that these biology classes, these science classes, are a bit like a language class and a science class all mixed into one. And to be sure, our anatomy and physiology is like that as well. Because much like if you're taking Spanish or German or whatever, you have to start with the basics first. You have to start with vocabulary. You have to know the words, the terms. You have to understand what they mean. And then once you learn those, then you can start putting those terms together in order to express your ideas. And you'll be expressing your ideas in your allied health science career in charts, or even talking to your colleagues, etc. And you've got to have the same language, right? So if you're just making up a word and writing it down in the chart, and the person that comes on the next shift looks at that word and they're like, I have no idea what they're talking about there, then communication is broken down. So you need to have this common language. And that's what this first chapter really starts with, is talking about orientation, talking about where things are located, and getting you introduced into terminology. So like we said, you're really going to be gaining this knowledge of how to communicate with others within the health sciences. So that's the main reason why certainly this matters. So as I was talking about, anatomy and physiology is really looking at two different things. You know, sometimes people look at that and they say, oh, what does that mean? It's all really the same, right? So let me get my pen somewhere here. And when we look at it, right, anatomy itself is going to be about the structure. So these are the pieces, parts, etc. And what are those parts' names? This is the ethmoid bone in here, and this is the mandible in here. And so we need to know the names of the parts. And then, what do those parts do? Why are they there? How do they work together to support life, etc.? So structure and function, anatomy and physiology. And these two parts of learning about the body are always meshed together. It's the form, or the anatomy, which allows that particular structure to do a particular job. So they're certainly well correlated. So we're always going to be talking about them together. Often we'll start with the structure first, so we know what we're talking about, and then we'll get into how it works. Now when we talk about biology, when we talk about anatomy, there's usually going to be different levels, much like maybe you learned in your general biology class. And so you can talk about kind of the largest level, which is gross or macroscopic anatomy. So if you're going in for a physical, or you're going to a physical therapist or something like that, they're going to be able to assess you in certain ways from a macroscopic view, not having to use a microscope. What can we see at the surface? What can we see with our naked eye? So that includes things like regional anatomy, systemic anatomy, so looking at particular systems, and a lot of anatomy, and our tour through it focuses on this level. There's also surface anatomy, like we said, how you can be assessed just looking at what's going on the surface of the body. Are you sweating? Do you have scars? Is there an abnormal color or something like that, right? If you go to the dermatologist, they're looking at particular body spots. Are they asymmetrical? Do they have a weird border? Do they have more than one color? Things like that for a mole or a body spot. All right, so then we move down from macroscopic to microscopic, and we will certainly do that in this class as well, because it's at the microscopic level, when we're studying things like the cells and the tissues, that allow us to understand how this big unit or the organism works. So it all builds upon one another, and we have this little unit, this little living unit that's called the cell. And it's the cell that really gives rise to the structure and function of the tissue or the organ or the organ system, etc. So we've got to get spun down to that level in order to understand really how the body works. There's also a branch of anatomy called developmental anatomy, where you're looking at these things and how they change through life, usually at the beginning and the end of life, but there are certainly some changes that occur through time as well. So, like we said, you really need to be able to know the terminology in order to be able to really understand what's going on with the body. If you look at this, last statement here, it says be able to observe, everybody can understand that one, manipulate, move, right, something like that, palpate, that's to feel, and auscultate. Auscultate is to listen. So if you think about, if you've been to the doctor and he's assessing you, he or she is checking you out for a physical or something that's going wrong, they're doing a lot of these different things in order to try to understand what's going on inside. So those are subdivisions of anatomy. When we look to physiology itself, when we look at physiology, we also find that it's going to have a kind of a different focus. We're looking at the function now, and oftentimes it's based on the organ systems itself. And when we try to understand these systems, like when we say renal physiology, again, we're looking at terminology there. So for renal, that may seem familiar to some of you. Others may have no clue, but renal means kidney. So when we're trying to understand how the kidney works, we're going to look at that urinary system, and we're going to look at its different components, even again, down to the cellular and molecular levels. So all of that, it's kind of like Legos, right? When you have individual Legos, they build together, and you can build some complex structures that do particular things. But without those individual building blocks and their particular shapes and functions, the whole structure isn't going to be able to work. So oftentimes we're going to be dependent on these cellular and even subcellular or molecular levels. So at times we're going to touch on even other sciences like physics or chemistry, etc., in order to understand how the living organism and the study of life or biology works. So like we said, this anatomy and physiology is going to be linked to one another. What a particular structure can do depends on the particular form, etc. They're complementary. And like we said, also complementary are these different levels of biology too, starting at the smallest level, which is the chemical level, individual elements or atoms, how they will be put together to form a particular molecule, right? So it may be hydrogen and carbon and oxygen, H2O, now we have a molecule, for instance. That's going to be an important molecule. O2, oxygen gas, carbon dioxide, CO2. Carbon dioxide is going to be another important gas. Some we want, some we don't want so much of, but all important. So we graduate from the chemical level up to the cellular level. We even have these little mini organs inside of our cells called organelles that often have different jobs like our internal organs do. And then we get up to particular cells. Now in general biology you learned about a generic cell, right? A generic cell, you just draw a circle like this, draw a little dot in it. And what's that dot? It's like Dora the Explorer, waiting for an answer. So that's the nucleus, right? And this line is the plasma membrane, that's the cell membrane. And inside of the cell you would have all these mini organs or organelles that would be maintaining life. And that's a generic cell. But as you can see from this example here, there are many other different types of cells in the body, and look at the structure of it. The structure is different, so that means the function is going to be different too, and we'll see that again and again. So when we have cells working together for a particular function, and usually attached to one another, then we graduate up to the tissue level. So when we're talking about tissues, right, not Kleenex, etc., similar types of cells usually attached to one another performing a particular function. And there's 4 main tissue types in the body, right? So we've got muscle tissue like you see here. There's also nervous tissue and epithelial tissue, a covering and lining tissue like your skin. And then there is nervous tissue, which works to control and coordinate. So when we have more than one tissue working together for a particular function, that's when we graduate up to the organ level. And when you look at this, you're like, I don't get it. A blood vessel, artery, vein, that's not an organ. Heart, that's an organ. I get that one. But carotid artery, jugular vein, how are those organs? Just a tube. But by definition, right, if we have an organ being made up of more than one tissue type, and we look at even a blood vessel where we're going to find epithelial tissue, the covering and lining, that's going to be lining the inside of it. You may even have some on the outside of it. You're going to have some muscle, smooth muscle like we talked about here, that's going to allow it to constrict and dilate, and you're going to have connective tissue kind of holding these things together. That's more than one tissue type right there. That's 3 out of the 4, and usually you have neurons or nerve cells going down to it telling it when to constrict and when to dilate, etc. So these individual blood vessels also count at organs. So we'll look at the organ level too, but then when we have the organs working together for a particular function, that's the organ system level, like the cardiovascular system. So those blood vessels, in addition to the heart, contribute to this whole system that has a particular job to do inside of you. And those organ systems then make up the organism that we see here. So through our tour of Bio 201 and Bio 202, we'll be doing a tour of these different organ systems. But you can see we've got a journey to make in order to get up to this level. We've got to understand all of these levels leading up to it first. So the first few chapters of knowledge that we're going to be learning together is going to be focusing on these levels instead. So first, orientation and just learning some terminology about the body. Then we get into the chemical level of life, the chemicals, the building blocks, if you will, of life. So we have to understand a bit about chemistry. Then we're going to work our way up, and we're going to start talking about, got to get into the cellular level, refresh our memory in terms of what cells do and how they reproduce and how they survive, because a cell, like we said, is a living unit, much like an organism is a living unit. And then we talk about tissues, and then finally we'll graduate up to our very first system of the body, which is the integumentary system, or the skin. So we've got a kind of ramping up to do, much like you see here, in order to get to that organ system level. And then we'll start organizing our knowledge and learning along the way at that organ system level. But each time we get to a new organ system, rest assured, we're going to be going down, down, down to these sub-levels of organization to understand how the system works overall. Okay, so one of the things that we were mentioning in this is that with these different organ systems and living cells, etc., they are helping us to sustain life. In order to do that, what do we need to maintain life in order to continue living? Whether it's a cell or whether it's you, you're going to need these particular things. So, for instance, these are functions. These are things that you're going to need to do as a living thing. So you're going to need to maintain boundaries, right? Good fences make good neighbors, they say. But basically, what we're talking about here is that we need to maintain inside and outside. So again, this could be like we talk about in terms of a cell, the plasma membrane, or in terms of you, we're talking about your skin, right? So your skin or your integumentary system is actually a border of you. But all the cells inside of you need borders too. We even have tissues that help to create borders, like epithelial tissue. So making boundaries and maintaining those boundaries is going to be important. Movement is also going to be an important thing, whether that is moving that particular cell, like a muscle cell, or whether that is moving something past the cells. So for instance, with the digestive system, it's very important that we move things through the digestive tract. Responsiveness, we've got to be able to respond to changes in the environment. If it's particularly hot and I'm out in the sun, I need to, in order to sustain life, particularly here in the desert, need to be able to move into the shade and get water and things like that. So if my environment changes, I need to be able to respond to it, and that occurs on a cellular level as well. Digestion, right? In order to sustain life, we know we all have to take in nutrients for these cells to sustain themselves, for them to have the energy that they need in order to reproduce and repair themselves, etc. Metabolism is really the set of chemical equations or reactions that sustain life, where we're breaking things down, kind of like in digestion, but we're also synthesizing things, we're building, like you go to the gym and your muscles get bigger. Those cells are getting bigger because we're adding more fibrils inside of them. In order to do that, in order to build things from the different nutrients that we've taken in, that's a whole series of chemical reactions that we will call metabolism. In addition to that, we have what's called excretion, where we're getting rid of waste products. So we're building things and we're breaking them down, etc. And just like a factory, not all of those different things that we change are going to efficiently change from one thing to another. There's going to be byproducts that we need to get rid of. So that's excretion. And then reproduction. Again, not only on a cellular level, right? Mitosis, we're making more and more cells. You get a cut, we got to repair it and fill it in, but reproduce on an organismal level as well, right? So there's many things that we share as a living unit with even these individual cells inside of us. And lastly, growth. So growth, right? You've got to potentially be able to get bigger. So that's going to be important as our bodies get bigger, as we are growing, as our bones will get bigger because there's more demands on them. An interesting thing about it, we talked about muscles getting bigger when you go to the gym. Your bones actually get bigger as well because the muscles are pulling on the bone. And so those bones actually get bigger and thicker in order to resist the tension that's being put on them. So growth is an important factor as well. Okay. So when we look at a lot of these necessary life functions, you may be able to look at those and say, oh, I can kind of figure out what system does that. Ooh, reproductive system, that does reproduction. Nice. Digestive system, that does digestion. Yes. Excretion, they're like, urinary system, right? To be sure. We'll find that the end of the digestive system also helps us to get rid of things, right? Movement is going to be muscular system. So there's a lot of different ways that we can pair these life functions with these organ systems or body systems that we have inside of us. So for instance, integumentary system, the skin, we said that this is going to be helping to maintain our borders. Skeletal system is for protection, but it's also for movement because like we said, those muscles attach to the bones. There's our muscular system. Now we're looking at skeletal muscle, but we know that there's smooth muscle already, like we saw in one of our previous slides. But then there's cardiac muscle too, all about movement. Nervous system to control and coordinate all of the systems together. Endocrine system is also a controlling and coordinating system, but uses hormones into the bloodstream as opposed to bzz, bzz, wired system like the neurons that we find as part of the nervous system. Cardiovascular system, a distribution system. Lymphatic system, this is one of the systems that people tend to forget about or know the least about. It kind of operates behind the scenes. As you'll notice, it doesn't have a lot of very large organs that you recognize, and so that's one, as we get to it, that a lot of people have some kind of surprising revelations about how your body works. So this system here, we'll get to it in Bio 202 second semester, but it's really important in terms of defending your body against foreign agents. Respiratory system for exchanging gases with the outside environment. Digestive system, like we said, for getting nutrients. Urinary system for regulating fluids in our bodies, as well as the content of those fluids. And then our reproductive system, both male and female. We'll find when we get to the reproductive system, that one is going to be 2 for 1. That's 2 very different systems that we're going to have to learn about. But again, don't worry, that's not till the end of Bio 202. So what we find is that there's a lot of important functions that these body systems are helping our bodies as an organism to accomplish. But in order to survive and accomplish those functions, we also need particular substances or factors. So for instance, we need nutrients and oxygen and water and warmth, if you will. Now when we look at these, you're looking at them, you're like, oh yeah, these are all good things, etc. But too much of anything can certainly be harmful. Too much or too little. So when you say normal body temperature, we don't want it too cold or too hot. When we talk about atmospheric pressure, you're like, I don't know. Why? Because that's weather? I don't get that. That has to do with the respiratory system, the concentration of these gases and being able to move these mixed gases into and out of our systems. So a lot of important, what we would say, factors that we need to be maintaining inside of us. Now when you look at this list, you can also see waste products aren't listed on there, but those are also something that we maintain at a level that's not too high or too low. And that gets us to this process that we call homeostasis as well. And homeostasis is what we're going to touch on again and again and again throughout all these systems. And this is the maintenance of a stable internal condition despite changes in our external environment. So it's a dynamic state of equilibrium. So much like your thermostat in your house and your heating and cooling system, it's maintaining this interior environment regardless of what's going on outside. Your body is working on maintaining homeostasis as well, your internal state. And each of these different organ systems are contributing in some way. So much like your system that you have in your house, we have to be monitoring it all the time to make sure that it's not getting too far off of what we call the set point. So when we look at a homeostatic control, what we usually have are three critical components: the receptor, the control center, and the effector. And when we're talking about the receptor, right, that would be like the thermometer in your thermostat. It's monitoring the environment. It says, what's going on right now? How are we now? And we respond to stimuli, changes in temperature or something like that, changes in calcium levels or blood pressure or whatever. The control center is going to be the brain, right? Maybe sometimes the spinal cord, etc. But the brain is basically the control center, kind of like the thermostat in your, in your unit that you have in your house, right? You've got a thermometer in there, but you have a thermostat in there that monitors it. It's got your set point to it. The set point is where you want it to be. The receptor tells you how it is currently. The set point is where you want it to be. Not too high, not too low. Now, if the current conditions are very close to the desired conditions, you don't have to make any adjustments. Like you're driving down a lane on the freeway, you're right in the middle of the lane, not going one side, one to the other side, you don't have to do any adjustments. But if you start to drift, boom, 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 driving by the braille system, then we need to make adjustments. And it's much better to make smaller adjustments than wide, crazy adjustments. Same thing for your house. You want to get up to 100 degrees before your air conditioner comes on and brings it back down to 78 degrees, right? So little adjustments are occurring all the time because we're monitoring it all the time. And the adjustments are going to be the role of the effector. So the effector produces an effect. So in your house, and I keep looking over there because that's where my thermostat is, in your house, right, you've got an air conditioner, you've got a heater. So it is going to receive a signal from the control center saying, hey, it's time to turn on and we need to get this situation, this current situation, back towards the set point. So what we find is that most of these homeostatic controls that we have in the body and in your house are working via what's called a negative feedback loop. And what that means is when you get negative feedback, like at work or something like that, right? You're like messing around or something like that, and your boss comes up and he says, hey, knock that off, get back on track, right? So you are starting to get off track and he nudges you back so that you're back on track, right? So if there's initial shift away from the set point, our whole idea is to nudge it back, nudge it back. If it goes this way, nudge it back, nudge it back. We're always doing these nudges to keep it right in line with the set point or as near as possible. Now, it's not going to be right on the set point exactly. There's going to be variation, right? It's going to get a little bit warm, the air conditioner is going to come on. It's going to get a little bit cooler, the heater is going to come on. And that's just one example, right? Calcium levels in the body, we do that all the time. Blood pressure, contractions in the heart and constricting the blood vessels. We're always working to maintain other aspects as well. So when we look at it, we're trying to maintain an internal balance. And if we get out of balance, the receptor is going to pick that up. It's going to send that information to the control center. The control center is going to compare that to the set point and decide whether it needs to do something or not. And if it does, it's going to bring into play the effector, a muscle or the lungs or the heart or something like that, that then is going to work to bring us back towards the set point again. So temperature, we've been talking about in terms of the house. This is really what we do here in Arizona. This might be, I don't know, Alaska or something like that. But these types of adjustments and monitoring adjustments are happening all the time. We're adjusting by doing sweating and things like that and staying inside. People who are getting too cold, they're doing adjustments by skeletal muscle shivering or behavioral adjustments, putting on layers, etc. But notice this is negative feedback. So here's the set point. We start to get away from it. Our response is always opposite to whatever that deviation is. So that's the negative aspect to it. Okay? Positive feedback doesn't really happen too much in the body, because what would happen in positive feedback? Positive feedback at your job, you're messing around and your boss goes, hey, what are you guys doing? You're not working. Ah, that's fine. Just keep doing what you're doing. Don't mind the customers, etc. Right? That's not going to maintain the stable internal environment of the restaurant. Same thing with your body. So positive feedback, if there's an initial change from the set point, that change is amplified and it continues to go away from the set point. That doesn't maintain a stable internal condition very well. So positive feedback comes into play in only a couple instances in the body that you see down here, and that is when women are going into labor, as well as forming blood clots. Not erroneously, but forming a scab or a blood clot so that we can stop leaking blood out of a broken blood vessel. And in this case, what we're trying to do is move very, very quickly in order to stop this particular condition from continuing. So leaking blood all over the place. We have these little blood fragments that are called platelets that adhere to the broken blood vessel, and as they adhere to each other, they release more chemicals that brings in more platelets that sticks and fills the hole, etc. And that just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going and builds and builds and builds like sandbags, so that we can stop that leakage as quickly as possible. Now there's a separate loop or chemical reaction that occurs to get rid of the blood clot or the scab when we need to, because otherwise this would just build and build and build. We'd fill it in and that whole blood vessel would be filled with a clot, right? So there's a separate mechanism that works to get rid of blood clots, but this one just quickly builds it so we can put that cork in the broken blood vessel so we don't die. Likewise, when we're talking about the birth of a baby, what we're doing is we're going from a state where we've been maintaining two individuals for a long period of time, and now we are going back to maintaining one individual. So we're really moving set points from 2 to 1, and positive feedback certainly does that. Okay, so as you get into your careers then, what you're looking to do is you're kind of doing super sleuthing and trying to figure out when there's a disturbance in the force, a disturbance in homeostasis, when somehow the normal stable internal condition is off. They've got a fever, they've got a bruise, they've got, cyanotic lips or something like that. Their lips have turned blue. They've got some sort of a tumor or some sort of a growth or something like that. And so when these different types of homeostatic mechanisms can't maintain a normal operating condition, then you may have a disease or a disorder, and we may need help with that. We may need your help as a health science person in the future. So that starts our introduction into the body and this whole idea of homeostasis and anatomy and physiology. Those are critical as we're starting into this process. Homeostasis is going to come up again and again. So make sure that you review that and understand it before we move further on and on and on. All right, so that should do it for now. We will see you again in our next lecture in part 2.